all over the world after 1980s, that is communicative language teaching, and some ideas from natural approach from Steven Krishnan. He's an important linguist in the United States of America. And of course, I'm going to use ideas of some British linguists who created communicative language teaching as well. And we are going to deal with also how to teach skill-based, because skill-based teaching will usually leads to communicative language teaching and testing. I would like to just, touch upon testing a bit, because usually people focus on teaching and ignore testing or assessment. And if you do not assess for skills, that creates some negative washback effect in the classroom. So that's going to be the talk altogether. And do we have any limit, like 40 minutes with the Zoom?
There is no limit.
There's no limit. Wonderful.
Yeah, feel free.
When you are tired, please let me know. I can talk about 3 hours, no problem with me. But let's have a break, about 15 minutes tea break. Then we will continue if it's okay with you. All right?
Sounds great.
So just remind me, after 60 minutes or so, so that we can stop and continue with this. Right, now let's go back to our slide. And this is my address, by the way. If you want to connect with me, you can just send me an email and ask some questions, or you can contact with me through this one, tpaker@gmail.com. That's my email address. Okay, now when we look at the purpose of language teaching, usually we come across this kind of expressions: to expose learners to the target language through attractive tasks and materials, so that they will develop a positive attitude towards that language, improve their self-confidence, and encourage them to understand and try to communicate in the target language. Everybody wants this. I mean, we will expect students to be able to communicate with self-confidence. But teachers usually has a certain attitude that initially, especially, they focus on accuracy more than fluency. And in this one, if we have such a equation, first accuracy, then fluency, then that creates some problems. So that's why what we can do as objectives, providing comprehensible input through attractive and interesting tasks and materials, and various topics and tasks depending on their age and level is very important. And providing individual constructive feedback depending on their performance, accepting that they will go through an interlanguage period depending on their pace, and encourage them to take part in all receptive and productive skills or skill activities in terms of individual, pair, and group work arrangements in the classroom or outside the classroom. Because learning cannot be limited to classroom only. It should continue out of the classroom as well. And before I move on to any approach and method, we should keep in mind that there are inter-learning situations in any kind of learning. So in language learning, we call this interlanguage. Selinker came out this idea in 1972, almost 50 years ago. But usually teachers ignore interlanguage phase of learning. So Latzo has a wonderful saying, I like this: you cannot change the route, but you can change the rate. So that's the teacher's role and students' motivation to increase, to change the rate of learning. So anyone who tries to learn a second language will go through these fields that's called interlanguage, but usually I like metaphors and I call this muddy fields. And when you walk through muddy field, you'll get dirty. So that's normal that all language learners will have some interlanguage problems, which means they are going to make a lot of mistakes. But since teachers focus on the mistakes more than necessary, then they lose their self-confidence, and then they cannot communicate and they ignore any kind of production in target language. So that's why I give a lot of importance that all teachers should be aware of interlanguage phase from when the students go through from their mother tongue to target language. So what are the roots of interlanguage? It is based on two types of errors we come across as a teacher. Language L1 transfer, that's which is normal in brain functioning, and also development errors. What are they? For example, we may have pronunciation L1 transfer. For example, in Turkish we don't have f sound. In Arabic you have. So that's why Turkish students don't say thank you, but they say thank you. We don't have W sound, but in Arabic you have wow, you know. So they don't say yellow, but they say yellow. Or sometimes they pronounce k sound in English. I don't know, etc. Then at word level, we have L1 transfer. For example, for us, we have one word for drinking and smoking. So that's why that is içmek, okay? So they just think that rather than saying smoke a cigarette, you may hear them saying drink a cigarette. Or rather than turn on computer, they may say open the computer. Because for Turkish, we have only one word for this. And sometimes they just choose a word in the dictionary when they want to have a picnic in the woodland and or in the forest. They prefer jungle. I asked my student, why did you use, and said, well, I like the pronunciation. Okay, at sentence level, especially because of the L1 transfer in Turkish, we don't we have emizar in Turkish, but we do not usually we do not pronounce it. So that's why when they speak English, they may say, "My stomach hungry," because we say stomach is hungry in Turkish. So rather than "I am hungry," because that's why they transfer by this way, or they just drop emizar my mother housewife today Friday air sunny. I don't know if that's the case for Arabic learners. I mean, whether you use to be or to have as a auxiliary. And today temperature 25 centigrade like Turkish. And for example, we don't use plurals with the nouns. So there are 5 books on the table. That sounds like Turkish. And we came here Monday. We don't use preposition before the days, for example. So that is L1 transfer. And in development errors, we come across this kind of problems as well. So children hear in the classroom from their teacher that, we have books, windows, teachers, students, everybody. Then why don't we say children's? And they have double plural as well, like men's, women's, or women's. And we have possessive adjective problems of students like Alikar rather than Aliskar, Jack mobile phone, I sister rather than my sister. And then they have a tendency to use regular verbs with the irregular ones in English, like go, drink, eat it, waked up, etc. And we don't have S, and I don't know whether that's a problem with the Arabic learners again. So they have this type of statement, my mom make a cake every day, rather than makes a cake, or Ece like computer games. Ece is the girl, by the way. So I have a quote from Chomsky. He says, all the exceptions in English will turn out as mistakes. Then think about the exceptions in English. Wow, thousands of them. So how will they learn all these, exceptions? They will learn by using them rather than memorizing. So teachers, have a tendency to make a list of irregular words, to make a list of, irregular plurals, adjectives, etc. Well, there may be some kind of reference lists, but don't expect them once you tell the students that they will just, memorize them and use them. They may memorize them. I have some, Hafiz students in my classroom. They memorize everything. But the problem is they cannot use it appropriately. Why? Because they haven't used with a certain frequency. So we come across processability model by Cook. He says children learn, when they learn a language, especially in the production level, they go through these stages. The first one is holophrastic. I mean, they just, for one sentence, for them is just one word. For example, if the baby says go, which means I want to go, or play, the baby wants to play, or drink, they want to drink, eat, they want to eat, have dinner, etc., or lunch. Then the second level is two words like take it, open book, come here, sit down. Then they start using chunks like did you go work or we play game. Then we go to the fourth stage is the telegraphic speech. I don't know, the young generation knows what telegram is or telegraph is. In that one, especially, you just drop auxiliary preposition in order to pay less. Once you are in 21st century generation or last 10 years or 20th century. So you were born digitally. So, but we have gone through all these processes. And in this one, you don't use prepositions. So we came Friday, mom not home. So you don't say mom is not home. So they go through this type of speech. And simple sentence structure comes out at the fifth phase, which means open your book, I'm playing now. Or finally, they reach complex sentence structure. Like while I was coming to school this morning, I saw an accident on the street. Wonderful. I mean, don't expect your students just, jump up the sixth stage without going through the other stages. Because language learning is just like, a baby is learning the language, whether you are a young learner or teenager, adult. I mean, this is the way our brain functions. So if we get to know our brain very well, then we will just, act accordingly. And now I want to move on to methods. How are we going to study methods? Especially we have a lot of methods historically. First of all, let me just change the slide. Sorry. First of all, this one. Yes, from historical point of view, there are a lot of approaches and methods because initially the first method is considered grammar translation method. And the purpose was to be able to read the either holy book like Bible or Quran or other religious books, and to be able to read and understand and improve their intellectual capacity. And that was not the purpose of communication. But that continued until the 19th century, because in 19th century there were a lot of movement, immigrations from Europe to the United States or from the other parts of the world. And also after the First World War, there were a lot of, again, immigrations among the continents. That's why, so when the immigrants came, they needed a language to be able to survive in the country. So that's why the first reactions to grammar translation started. So we have direct method, and then audiolingual method, especially after the Second World War, and situational language teaching. And in fact, the first method, which is based on learning theory, is the audiolingual method, which is based on behaviorism. So it is based on habit formation, and they consider that if the language is given as a stimulus, students will understand and respond, and the teacher, if they produce in the right way, the teacher will give reinforcement. And they used dialogues a lot, conversations a lot, to be able to introduce the language and then to reinforce correct pronunciation, correct grammar, correct vocabulary. So they focused on structure, and they focused on accuracy more than the meaning and the message. So there were a lot of repetitions because the purpose was automatic response. And as a reaction to this one, especially Chomsky criticized behaviorist people, and they said, we have a brain to think. We are not parrots, to just memorize the language and then produce it. So even in the first language, we produce something. Children, especially after observing children, he came up with the idea that even children produce language which is not in the language. So he came up with the idea of generative grammar. If you know only one word, then you can produce infinite sentences with one structure. So imagine that you just introduce yourself, with one language, then you can introduce your mother, your father, your sister, your brother with the same way. That helps you to do this. So that's why we have two new methods based on this, like silent way, which means the teacher usually introduces the language and then the teacher keeps usually silent so that students will deal with the material. They try to communicate with each other, especially in the production stages, which is very important. Still, today, the teacher is silent in the production, like pair work, group work activities, while the teacher introduces the task and students try to come up with the answer or try to complete the task. And we have one more, total physical response by Escher. He had similar ideas in a way with cognitive learning, and language acquisition is very important. The stages, he said, first they have to learn to listen like babies, even without producing a word. They should learn to react bodily. If you have young children around you, nephews, nieces, sometimes they don't even utter a word. But when you give some orders like bring me this thing, or take this toy here, or when you give instruction, okay, let's dance, let's sing, let's do this, they will do it with you. But even they won't produce a word. So he came up with this idea, and we are going to deal with later. And the second thing he said, right brain, left brain issue, brain lateralization. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes time as well. So after cognitive learning, we had another reaction, humanistic learning. They said, okay, our brain has, motor skills like behaviorism. Cognitive thinking is important, but how about our emotions? Especially in audiolingual method, students were under stress because the teacher asked them to pronounce correctly with right rhythm, right intonation, right pitch, etc. And even especially adults had a lot of problems with this, and they were under stress. Even when they use chain drill, they say, "Please pass me, skip me." They used to say. I used audiolingual method when I first started teaching in state schools. So I had this kind of problems as well. So in humanistic learning, the key word is we should have stress-free environment, because human brain learns, especially when they have stress-free environment. And Christian came up with a similar idea like affective filter. So we have Suggestopedia, Lazano, Bulgarian psycholinguist, and community language learning, Turan. He came up with this method as well. And if you look at this, especially the first methods, audiolingual method, situation language teaching, silent way, total physical response, they usually had structural syllabuses. They aimed that, first of all, students should develop accuracy, then they will deal with fluency. But later on, people have seen that it's not the way our brain functions as it happens with children. First, we learn with fluency, then we develop accuracy. So that's why when we give tasks to our students, we expect them to be as communicative as possible, as fluent as possible, rather than accurate. Because we know that they are going to, especially with A1, A2, or beginner, lower intermediate students will go through interlanguage, and they will come across the problems that I've mentioned a few minutes ago. So we have constructivism, and we came up with communicative language teaching, natural approach, task-based instruction, content-based instruction methods. And the key word for them was emotions are important. Yes, it should be cognitive. And yes, we can have certain repetitions, other things, but the most important thing is meaningfulness. So what you say, what you hear should be meaningful to you. When you hear someone speak, if someone talk, if you don't have any meaning in your thinking balloon, then it is just a noise for you. For example, if I write a sentence in Turkish now, will it be meaningful to you? No. Then, if it is not meaningful, I mean, the stimulus that we get is not meaningful to the learner, it is just a noise, it is just a picture. So imagine that you go to a Chinese restaurant, and all the menu, I mean, items on the menu is Chinese. Can you read Chinese? Most probably no. So even you don't know what you are going to eat about, because everything is in Chinese pictograms. Okay, then the last one we came up in language teaching is multiple intelligence. Multiple intelligence is not a method; it is just a idea of how our brain learns by Howard Gardner from the United States, from MIT. But it has one influence on language learning. What is it? As a teacher, we know that our students have different intelligences, like music intelligence, language dominant, music dominant, sports dominant, art dominant, nature dominant, etc. You know, there are 8 types of intelligences. And as a teacher, we, in order to meet their intelligence dominance, we have to create variety of activities, variety of tasks, variety of materials, so that we should differentiate different tasks, different materials. So, at the end, students will be able to find something related to their learning styles or learning preferences. So in that case, Suggestopedia, community language learning, communicative language teaching, natural approach, task-based instruction, content-based instruction, they're all interactional type of methods. So that's why we use them, and we have some, we try to be eclectic nowadays by using different things. For example, Suggestopedia encourages us to use music in the classroom. I don't know whether you use or not, but I use a lot, especially when the students in writing courses, when they write a paragraph or when they write a essay in the classroom, I just use instrumental music or classical music, so that students are usually silent and they just listen to music at the same time. Otherwise, for example, I'm a music person. If I can't hear music, I cannot study very well. You know what happens otherwise? I listen to the outside noise. I can hear all different types of noises, but music keeps a constant noise with me, especially the nice one. So when we analyze the method, I'm going to focus on some sub-components of a method. What is it? What's the theory of language? What's the theory of learning? Objectives, syllabus, types of learning and teaching activities, learner roles, teacher roles, and the role of instructional materials. So as a language teacher, I should be aware of all the bits and pieces of a method regarding these sub-items. And also keep in mind that especially we have 2 types of or mixed type of classrooms, from teacher-centered to student-centered classes. And in the teacher-centered, that's the traditional one. The teacher presents something, the teacher makes the practice, the teachers ask students to produce, but still everything is under the control of the teacher. Let me give you an example from audiolingual method. When you ask a student a question like, what are you going to do in the afternoon? So the teacher gives prompts. Go to the library. Okay, I'm going to go to library. Play football. I'm going to go to play football. So they give always prompts so that students will produce in the target language. But in student-centered classes, you just ask the question, what are you going to do in the afternoon? Well, it's the student choice to answer in any way they like. For example, students say play football, and does not make even a sentence. Even we don't expect them to make full sentence as in a direct method, but usually they will just produce with one word, one chunk, or a phrase. But the important thing is communication here. And usually when I give seminars to teachers, they ask me, when are they going to make full sentences? Well, especially we encourage them to make full sentences when they write a paragraph, because the genuine writing, the real writing starts with a task, and it's usually paragraph writing rather than just sentence writing or something. Because what we give different topics and we teach through topic based. So the topic could be introduce yourself, talk about your family, talk about your leisure time, etc., or talk about your narrate your typical day. So what will happen is that they are just going to deal with the topic, and of course they are going to produce full sentences. So in student-centered, the teacher usually brings the material so that students will meet the new language. Okay, so that what does the teacher bring? Especially in the natural approach, Krishan talks about comprehensible input. It should be comprehensible for the learner. Otherwise, it's just going to be a noise, or it's just going to be a picture for them. And the teacher encourages students to manipulate the new language through various types of activities. So it could be pair work, individual work, group work, class work, like discussion, comparison, contrast activities, or narration activities. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can do as a teacher, so that hopefully the language will be their own language by the time. And by the way, if I ask this question, please just turn on your microphone and tell me, is English your language?
No.
No. Okay. Does anyone who agrees with me that English is your language? No. English is my language, your language too. It is a space in our brain now. Since we study and since we communicate in English, it is our second language, third language, fourth language. God has given us a miracle brain that we can learn even 20 languages. Our brain has this capacity. As long as you use different languages, they are all your languages. For example, I speak Turkish, English, French, Arabic. So they're all my languages. As long as I communicate with people through one of the languages, it's my language and it's in my brain. So that is the, acknowledgement. You recognize that it is your own language. If it is your language, then you try to improve it, you try to communicate with it, and you try to have good relationships with people. So that's why I always tell my students that English is your language now. It's your second language, third language, whatever languages you have. And what's an approach, what's a method, what's a technique? There is a distinction between them. An approach is a set of correlative assumptions dealing with the nature of language teaching and learning. So approach is something theoretical, okay? It describes the nature of the subject matter to be taught. So when we talk about communicative approach, which means whatever we do in the classroom, we do for the purpose of communication. If you have, for example, structural approach, then your purpose is to teach the structure so that your students will have accurate language rather than communicative. So it depends on which approach you choose, or if you work in an institution, what approach they have. You are just going to do your operations or all teaching and learning activities based on this. But on the other hand, a method is an overall plan. You plan in advance for an orderly presentation of language material, no part of which contradicts and all of which is based upon the selected approach. So a method is procedure. For example, if you say, I'm going to use audiolingual method, then you are going to deal with behaviorism. I mean, stimulus and the student will be agent, and they will get the input and produce, and we expect them to produce accurately with right pronunciation, right pitch, right intonation, right vocabulary, etc. Then your expectation and your activities are like this, and you have a lot of drills. But if you say, my method is communicative language teaching, then you try to create more communicative tasks and activities in the classroom and outside the classroom as well. So it's in line with this. But on the other hand, we have various techniques that we use in the classroom, which is implementational. It takes place in a classroom context. It's a particular trick or stratagem or contrivance used to accomplish an immediate objective. So techniques must be consistent with the method and therefore in harmony with an approach as well. So Anthony came up with this idea in 1963, 58 years ago, okay? So after talking about all general description, now I'd like to focus on the first method that I want to share. Is everything so far fine?
Yeah, everything is cool.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Let me
Yes.
turn on the second presentation. Okay. Now we share. Okay, now we are going to focus on natural approach. First approach, then we are going to deal with method. Okay. Yes, this gentleman is American linguist Stephen David Gresham. He came up with this idea, natural approach, in 1980s. Okay, he developed by this approach by Tracy Terrell in 1977, and it's based on his theories about second language acquisition process. It had a big impact on the language teaching process in the US and around the world, and a language teaching method which is based on the assumption that learning a foreign language must follow the same patterns as the learning process of the native language. In fact, direct method in 1840s or 50s had the same idea, but he had, since he's a linguist, he came up with theories rather than just, assumptions. It gives emphasis on activities based on comprehensible input, especially and meaningful communication rather than on only grammatical mastery of language. It's a pity that in a lot of classrooms in the world, still grammatical mastery of language is favored rather than meaningful communication. That's the same in Turkey. Students go through about 1,500 class hours of studying English as a second language from primary school to high school. Even they cannot communicate at A1 or A2 level. Why? Because teachers usually teach grammar and give grammar activities and test grammar. So at the end of the day, students cannot communicate. Some of them say, I can understand, but I cannot speak. Why not? Because they haven't gone through skill-based activities in the classroom. Our brain functions in a way that we have one slogan. What is it? Use it or lose it. So if you don't use it, then you lose it. Okay? And although natural approach and natural method share same features, there are important differences with direct method, and shared features they are believed to conform to the naturalistic principles found in second language acquisition. And the difference is, unlike natural method, however, it places less emphasis on teacher monologues, direct repetition, formal question and answers, and less focus on accurate production of target language sentences. But in direct method, in 18 or in the 19th century, they focused on still, as I said, structure and grammar more than communication. In natural approach, there is an emphasis on exposure or input rather than practice, and optimizing emotional preparedness for learning. A prolonged period of attention to what the language learners hear before they try to produce languages, and a willingness to use written and other materials as a source of comprehensible input. So any kind of thing can be source of material. Whatever is spoken in the world is a material that you can take into your classroom. As language teachers, we are the really luckiest group among teachers. You know why? For example, a math teacher can teach only mathematical subjects. I mean, trigonometry, calculations, division, subtraction, addition, etc. A geography teacher usually has to focus on geographical features. A history teacher talks about history, but language teachers can talk about anything they like. So that's why We can have a party in the classroom, we can sing songs, we can play games, we can do activities. So that's why I enjoy my job very much. Why? Because I feel free, independent in bringing any kind of tasks. You can bring films into classroom and you can watch films. And you can, for example, I play the bağlama, which is Turkish folk music instrument. I take it and then we sing song together. So it's our, privilege to be a language teacher. Natural approach is also close to the total physical response by James Escher. For both methods of teaching, language emphasize the necessity of exposing the learner to hearing and understanding the language first before requiring the learner to speak. So they first should be able to understand. If there is no comprehension, there is not going to be any production. So it should be, in a phase by phase. I mean, with a sequence. The skills are taught in a natural order of acquisition, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Well, I don't agree with this one, and it doesn't have to be listening, speaking. I'm talking about in a natural environment. But in school, we usually introduce all of them. I mean, students listen, and then if they can read and write, they can read something about in the target language, and they can write. Even they write before they speak. So that's the language, not a language, natural language environment. That's the classroom environment. Uh, if you look at the theory of language, communication is the primary function of language in this method. And this approach focuses on teaching communicative approach, and they reject earlier methods such as audiolingual method that views grammar as the basis, and vocabulary is of paramount importance as language is essentially its lexicon. Why? Why vocabulary is important? Let me give you another example. For example, I know 10 words in Arabic and I can communicate with you, even without knowing the structure, okay? I can say, for example, I know one sentence, Uridu min ash-shay. If I say, I'd like to drink water, I don't know if it's meaningful for you, okay? Then if I say, Uridu min ab, I want to drink water, I want to drink, Uridu min, I don't know how to say orange juice in Arabic, but so if I know these vocabulary, I can just continue with this, with one structure, okay? So vocabulary is paramount important. Language is viewed as a vehicle for communicating meaning and messages. So when you make a mistake, it's the problem of the listener that to make meaning out of this. So that's why I encourage my students to communicate however they like. If your addressee does not understand you, then you have to negotiate it. What do you mean? Please tell me, explain it with what other words, etc. So that's what's happening in the street, and that's why in pair work and group work activities, I usually encourage my students to speak in the target language, which is English, by any means that they can. They can use body language, hand movements, other, pictures, drawing, so that they'll be able to communicate. But if they like, they can insert some L1 as well. Language acquisition cannot take place unless the acquirer understands the messages in the target language and has developed sufficient vocabulary inventory. So introducing vocabulary with a certain amount is very important. And shared feature with audiolingual method is that they both see language learning as a master of structures by stages. What does it mean? So the more you use it, the more you practice it meaningfully, the better you retain in your long-term memory. That's why master of structures through the usage is very important. And I+1, which means it's another, idea of crescent, hypothesis of crescent, which means acquirers need to understand input language that includes a structure that is part of the next stage, which means when you bring at the level of students any materials, they say, well, I know this. So that should be a bit challenging. So that's why information is the knowledge level of the students, and you bring one level up so that they can be, for example, when they read a passage, a paragraph, there may be 4 or 5 new vocabulary they can tolerate. But if there are 20 or more new vocabulary for them, they will be blocked. Then it's not going to be I+1. It's going to be I+3, 4, 5. So that's why sometimes I have this problem. Then they bring me something to translate from medical school. And I say, well, I cannot translate it because I'm not a medical person. Even it is in Turkish, I wouldn't be able to understand. And usually I do this with my female students. I say, when you open the boot of the car, okay, how much do you know about the car? Do you know engine? Do you know bougie? Do you know, I don't remember even some of the names in English. So if you haven't used them, it's not the language, it's the content knowledge that you have, that you have with you. It's the schemata. And the theory of learning, the theory is based on Kreshren's second language acquisition theory, and the Kreshen grounded the natural approach on a number of theory of learning tenets. And the first one is acquisition learning hypothesis. He says there are two distinctive ways of developing competence in a second or foreign language. Acquisition, the natural way paralleling first language development in children, and the subconscious learning or unconscious process that involves the naturalistic development of language proficiency through understanding language and using language for meaningful communication. Especially children do this. Why? Because they have to interact with the mother, father, other family members, etc. Or some of my young learners do it by playing computer games, interactive games. So during the games, they don't focus on the structure or vocabulary, but they just focus on the meaning to be able to continue the game. And so acquisition is developing competence by using language for real communication. Learning is a process in which conscious rules about the language are developed. So in learning, we have structure. Okay, we say simple present tense, simple past tense, present perfect tense. But when we communicate with people, when you listen to me now, do you have any tenses in your mind that the teachers uses simple present tense, present perfect tense, simple past tense? Never. We never use meta language in our brain to understand. So why do we teach them? Just, especially adults, to help adults to find some kind of familiarity with what they know. We believe that, we assume that will increase the rate of learning. If you talk about this meta language with young learners, they will be blocked. For example, when you talk about adjective, they say, what's adjective? What is adverb? How can you explain, let's say, 5 or 6 or even a 7-year-old child what an adjective is? It's the, meta language that we use as adults. So that's why what we can do, we should teach through activities that they are going to deal with or that they are going to be interested. So formal teaching is necessary for learning to occur from time to time. And also in learning, we expect results in explicit knowledge about the forms of language and the ability to verbalize this knowledge. And according to the theory, learning cannot lead to acquisition, Kreshen says. I've discussed it with Kreshen, and I don't know whether you agree with this. I mean, if you just learn the structure, tenses, or vocabulary by memorizing, it doesn't lead to acquisition, he says. Do you agree? Can anyone share his ideas or her ideas? I mean, by studying grammar, he says you cannot, communicate communication. Yes, who's going to speak? Any volunteers? No?
I'll speak.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I don't think that I agree with him, because if you acquire all these or if you gain all these skills, grammatical, and you learn, I think it's just the theoretical side of it. You need to go into the outside world, because from my own research, I think the best way to learn a language is to be put in that place. For example, you want to learn English, you go to an English speaking country. Nobody would cater to you and speak your language. I think that is the best way to learn. And I don't think if you talk to a native, they will take time to explain the grammatical side of it. They will just freely explain to you or talk to you, and maybe with some body language, and it'll take you time, but you would understand it. And that's it.
In that case, The learners will not be able to learn English in Morocco. They have to go to either United States or one of the English-speaking countries. For example, I learned English in Turkey without visiting any of the English-speaking countries. How come? And I learned English, especially since I was born in 1960s, through grammar translation and audiolingual method. We studied grammar a lot, and our teacher was very particular about accuracy. But still, I can communicate, and it is my second language after Turkish, and I have acquired it. So it takes time. Krishan wants to emphasize that if you do it more naturally, it will be quicker to retain the language. But if you deal with grammar or meta language, it will delay. But of course, it depends on you. It depends on your motivation. And nowadays, learning a language is so easy because we have media, and you can watch the same film again and again. You can read the same story. You can ask the computer to read the story, and you can listen. I mean, it's a piece of cake. So the most important thing is how you are going to adjust I+1 issue with the material. Any other ideas?
Professor,
Yeah, please go ahead.
are you hearing me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. My idea is that I will provide an example of the households in the United States that, for example, have a Spanish mother and an American father. So we can see that the children grow up to talk perfect English and perfect Spanish because it is an unconscious acquisition that happened since birth. And we know that children are more prone and acceptant of languages from the ages of birth to 6 years old. But when it comes to second language acquisition for, let's say, a classroom, it does take a lot of time and a conscious effort from the part of the learner to actually acquire that language. It won't happen just kind of inherently. It requires a lot of exercise, a lot of grammar, a lot of communication, a lot of practice and analysis. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we are not lucky enough like the child that you have talked about. I mean, our both mother and father spoke the same language, so we were monolingual. But there are some, minorities in the world that their relatives live in different parts of the world. So children, travel to those countries and they learn 3 or 4 languages all at the same time. So it's a metro exposition with the language. Even adults can learn 4 or 5 languages. The problem is, are you going to use it for communication or not? Do you really need it? Because our brain does not learn anything if it believes that it doesn't need it. So that need is the main generator, main trigger to learn. Okay. I agree with you. It takes time when you learn it in a non-English speaking country, but nowadays it's also so easy. Why? Because we can watch English films with subtitle, and then we are exposed to target language discourse in any means. So it's so easy now compared to past. Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. Let's go on. And monitor hypothesis is the second one. Conscious learning can function only as a monitor or editor that checks and repairs the output of the acquired system. That's right. We monitor ourselves. For example, when you hear me speaking English, I may have different pronunciations compared to native speakers that you have heard. But I'm a Turkish person and my pronunciation will sound like Turkish. It's inevitable. Your pronunciation may have some elements of Arabic. That is normal. Okay. So I don't even want to sound like British or American because the way I sound is my identity. Do you agree with me? So that's so normal. An Italian will speak English like an Italian. A German will speak English like a German. So no need to, to, you know, sound like a country person or an English-speaking country person. Also, that disguises other people. They have different expectations as if you were native speaker. So the most important thing is to be able to communicate meaningfulness. Okay, that's my idea. You don't have to agree with me. And another hypothesis is natural order hypothesis. Grammatical structures are acquired in a predictable order, which means certain grammatical structures or morphemes are acquired before others in first language acquisition of English, and a similar natural order is found in a second language. So then we do not have to, you know, urge students to learn certain structures before the other. And if you look at the textbooks, usually still they are structural. First, you are exposed to be present, then they, you know, introduce simple present tense, then going to future, then simple past, present perfect. That goes on with that order. Who guarantees that you will, I mean, children will learn simple present tense or present continuous tense first? It's a matter of acquisition. Imagine that you tell stories simple past tense with the child will learn simple past tense before any other tenses. So it's a matter of how the brain functions. And errors are signs of naturalistic developmental process. We talked about interlanguage, and similar developmental errors occurs in learners during acquisition, but not during learning, no matter what their native language is. So if you just, you know, give mechanical drills, students will correctly do it. Just give one example, they can do 200 of them. But in natural communication, you can easily identify their problems. And another hypothesis, input hypothesis, we talked about I+1. It claims to explain the relationship between what the learner is exposed to of a language input and language acquisition. And it involves four main issues. These are: input hypothesis relates to acquisition, not to learning. It states that people acquire language best by understanding input that is highly beyond their level of competence. Kreshn refers to this by the formula of I+1, which is called comprehensible input. And in the input hypothesis, the ability to speak fluently cannot be taught directly. Rather, it emerges independently in time with low affective filter after the acquirer has built up linguistic competence by understanding input. So if you correct the student's mistake all the time in the classroom, if you always give importance to accuracy, your students will delay the emergence of target language. So it's very important that the teacher should be just like affectionate mother. Think about a mother, you know, does the mother imagine that, I don't know what's happening in Arabic, but in Turkish, our children speak different words with the mothers. For example, instead of saying egg, they say gakka. Instead of they saying food, they say mama, etc. But I haven't seen a mother say correcting their children. You should say this, you should say that, because this Turkish people speak. No, they just even make a festival because the child utters a word. So we should even encourage our students to utter in the target language with one word, with one chunk, with one phrase, whatever they can. So this encouragement is very important in the provision of effective filter and in the provision of self-confidence. Because if your students do not have self-confidence, they won't produce in the target language. Affective filter hypothesis is that emotional states and attitudes are adjustable filters that freely pass or impede or block input necessary to acquisition. A low affective filter is desirable because in this one, they feel free to communicate. And three kinds of affective and attitudinal variables are: motivation, learners with high motivation do better; self-confidence, learners with self-confidence do better; anxiety, learners with low anxiety do better. So that it's the teacher who creates this environment. And acquires with a low affective filter seek and receive more input, interact with confidence, and are more receptive than to the input they receive. Anxious acquirers have a high affective filter, and it prevents acquisition, and they usually avoid communication. Uh, these five hypotheses have obvious implications. As much comprehensible input as possible must be presented, and whatever helps comprehension is important. Body language, pictures, films, music, whatever it is. And the focus is in the classroom should be on listening and reading first. Speaking should be allowed to emerge by the time, and input should be interesting so that effective filter may lower. The syllabus. First, Christian and Terry list some typical goals for language courses and list them under 4 areas. First, basic personal communication skills should be developed. And these are oral listening to announcement in public places. Then basic personal communication skills, written, reading and writing personal letters or communication. Then after this stage, in the third stage, academic learning skills like listening to a lecture, and in the fourth one, taking notes in the class or in the lectures, etc. And they state that the purpose of language course will vary according to the needs of the students and their particular interest. So that's why you should always look for what the interests and motivation of your learners are, depending on whether they are teenagers, adults, young learners, etc. And it's designed to depend on learners' needs, and the students are expected to deal with a particular set of topics in a given situation. Krishan and Terrell say that we do not organize the activities of the class about grammatical syllabus, but they organize everything around a topic. And the types of learning teaching activities, emphasis on presenting comprehensible input in the target language first, and teacher talk focuses on objects in the classroom and on the content of pictures, like direct method. And learners are not required to say anything until they feel ready. So they are encouraged, but when the students are ready to speak, they will speak. And teacher provides simple response opportunities like asking questions and eliciting one-word answers, and gradual progression from yes, no question to more complex responses as well. And here I said I'm going to talk about brain lateralization of James Escher. He says we have left hemisphere and right hemisphere. And first with right hemisphere, we do the activities, okay? It's, we have special reasoning, face recognition, music, they're all here. And when we do the activities, left hemisphere labels it. I mean, language occurs by this way. So computation and logical reasoning are in this left side. So that should be in harmony with each other. But if you teach the language structurally, what you do, you teach language through language without action. So that delays learning. So that's why it's very important to do some kind of total physical types of activities first. And we said vocabulary is important. Let's say we just introduce an apple. And he says, if you teach the imperative, eat an apple, then after doing this, English is, additional language. They will add some words as pre and post, but still the main bulk, eat an apple, will stay there. Look, that's a phrase, eat an apple. Then when you ask a question, it is, do you like eating an apple? Will you eat a green apple? I eat red apples every day. I haven't eaten a yellow apple. Can you eat an apple? Etc. That goes on, as you see, around the same thing. So if you teach 500 concepts like this, learners will develop their language in a very short time, he says. Imagine that you teach 500 chunks first with certain vocabulary, then they will just process it. And another example, let's open the book, for example. So will you open the book, please? Will you open the book quickly, slowly, angrily, happily? I have opened the book. We have opened the book. Susan has opened the book. As you see, there are different inflections, but the main bulk, open the book, stays there. Learner roles, language acquirer is the processor of comprehensible input. They understand and they process it, and is challenged by input that is highly beyond his or her current level, and learners' roles change according to their stage of linguistic development as well. And learners' role change, I said, according to their stage of linguistic development. In the pre-production stage, students participate in the language activity without having to respond in the target language by acting out, like total physical response. In the early production stage, single words, chunks, or short phrases, and fill-in charts, students struggle with the language and make many errors, which are corrected based on content and not structure. Are we going to correct errors? Yes. As a teacher, we take notes and we give individual feedback rather than the whole classroom. I don't know what's happening in your classes, but I usually prefer giving individual feedback. You say this way, but English people speak this way, rather than this is wrong, this is, a weak point, etc. And in the speech emergent phase, students involved in games and role plays, promoting fluency through a variety of more challenging activities. On the other hand, teacher has three central roles. That is, teacher is primary source of comprehensible input in the target language first of all. Then the teacher creates an interesting, friendly, stress-free environment in the classroom. And teacher must choose and combine a lot of activities to differentiate and meet the needs of learners. And for the instructional materials, they should relate classroom activities to the real world, because we bring the real world to the more we bring the real world to the classroom, the more we prepare our students for the real world. And we promote comprehension and communication, supply extra linguistic context that helps the learner to acquire. And materials could be really rather than textbook, pictures, visual aids, maps, advertisements, etc. And even these are, obsolete now. If you have internet connection, and if you can bring some films are wonderful representatives of real life. So that's why I usually have film-based language teaching rather than textbook. Textbooks are only for reading, but for me, films are wonderful elements, or animated stories are wonderful elements to teach language. Conclusion: meaning is considered as an essence of language, and vocabulary, not grammar, is the heart of language. Students listen to teacher using the target language communicatively from the very beginning, and students are allowed to use the creative language alongside the target language as part of the language learning process. In early stages, students are not corrected during oral production, as the teacher is focusing on meaning rather than form, unless the error is so drastic that it actually hinders meaning. It focuses on a wide range of activities, including games, role plays, dialogues, group work, and discussions. And students are involved in natural communicative interactions, which helps to acquire much useful vocabulary and structures which can be used in real life situations. And just, an example for A-level production from my students. They say, my mom, a book by. That's Turkish syntactic structure. Because in Turkish, the verb is at the end. In English, it is subject-verb agreement, but we have the agreement at the end, which means my mother has bought a new book. My mom buy a book. Still, S is missing. Last night, I television watch. Or last night,